So I'm Gabriel Shapiro. I'm a corporate and securities attorney, and I was really a mergers and acquisitions attorney for most of my career. And then a couple of years ago, I got bit hard by the blockchain bug. I now have a solo practice advising blockchain entrepreneurs. And I also have a company called Zero Law that has designed a security token protocol for Ethereum. And we also advise other company on tech development for blockchains, et cetera. But today, what I'm going to talk about is really sort of the collision of law and blockchain technology. And this is part of a much sort of longer talk, but I'm just going to do a portion of it. But to determine which portion to do, I would like to take a sort of a survey. So just show of hands, how many lawyers or law students in the room? Okay, oh, wow, almost everyone. Okay, cool. And how many people, and then in this case, leave your hands up and then lower them when something is not true of you. How many people know what Bitcoin is? How many people know what Ethereum is? How many people know what a smart contract is? How many people feel like they understand how any of those things work? Cool. Okay. So what I really want to talk about is a mentality amongst lawyers. So I've heard this from older generations of lawyers until I got into blockchain, which is if you're working on a transaction, and I was a tech lawyer, so did deals for Facebook, I did deals for Oracle, heavy in tech. And I can tell you that during the entire time I was doing tech M&A deals, I barely ever cared about the details of the technology of the company that was being acquired in the M&A deal. And why is this? Because it didn't matter. It didn't change how I drafted anything. What I was drafting was, how do you, the buyer is purchasing a certain amount of stock, or two companies are merging together. I just cared about the law. I cared about deal practices within that market. The nitty-gritty details of the technology simply did not matter. But I'm going to make the case that that really isn't true of blockchain and sort of the new wave of avant-garde technologies that we're seeing, AI, digital assets, these sort of things, that as a transactional attorney, you need to understand the tech, and you actually need to change your drafting practices to properly reflect how they work. So as I do that, I'm going to explain some unique things about blockchain. So there'll be a little bit of tech, and then I'll explain some unique, legal responses to that. And what the hypo that I'm going to give is just a very simple one, which is that basically, someone wants to buy something from someone else and they want to pay cryptocurrency for it, right? So let's just look at like a normal contract provision. At the closing, party A shall transfer $500 million to party B. They're buying something big. Maybe they're buying a company, right? So this would sort of be naive drafting, right? Like if you look at M&A agreements, you're not going to see this language most likely. You're probably going to see something a little more sophisticated that says something like, at the closing, Party A shall transfer $500 million in United States dollars to Party B by same-day SWIFT wire transfer of immediately available funds in accordance with the wire transfer instructions attached hereto as Exhibit A, and Party A shall present evidence reasonably satisfactory to Party B that such transfer has occurred, right? It's a little bit more formal. It's a little bit more particular. We're talking about $500 million, so people like to be precise about that sort of thing, and they like to know when the transaction is done so that it's legally settled and it has closed, right? That matters in law and in closing a transaction. So what happens, right, if instead of 500 million US dollars, now it's Bitcoin or it's ETH? How does the drafting change? Well, in a sense, it's sort of the same issue, right? You could draft it naively. You could say, at the closing, Party A shall transfer 1 million ETH to Party B. And the case I'm going to make is that, yeah, it was a little naive here when you talk about dollars. When you're talking about cryptocurrency, it's like 10 times more naive and 10 times more dangerous, to just use this simple language. And the reason for that is that blockchain poses unique risks, and that requires unique drafting. So the first question around this naive language would be, it says transfer the ETH, but what is a transfer of a cryptocurrency, right? What does that really mean? What is the value at stake? So the first risk is that really, unlike dollars, which is kind of like, a denomination of value that the whole world can agree on and is quite stable. Cryptocurrencies are very, very volatile, right? So you want to be precise. What do you mean by the value here? Do you mean, when you say 1 million ETH, do you mean literally 1 million units of the currency Ethereum, or do you mean $1 million worth of ETH? If you mean $1 million worth of ETH, how do you determine that, right? Because it's fluctuating all the time. And so a lot of the drafting techniques that I would use for this really come from stock for stock deals, where, they'll do like a volume weighted 30-day average, or they'll have various collars, and they'll essentially be a formula in the agreement to determine, how much ETH is worth $1 million or whatever the amount is. So it's I don't think there's a lot to be said about that, but the basic idea is you need to account for this volatility in terms of existing precedent for that. It would come from the stock for stock type of deal world, right? So you could do average of the high and low on some cryptocurrency exchange for some period of days or something like that, and divide that by the dollar amount. The next sort of risk or issue is that how many people know what a hard fork is or a soft fork when it comes to a blockchain? A couple people, not many. Okay, cool. So one of the things, this is actually true of all open source software, right? Public blockchains like Ethereum, like Bitcoin, ultimately their rules are built into open source software clients. And typically they're referred to as clients. In the case of Bitcoin, the main one is called the Bitcoin Core client. In the case of Ethereum, the main one is called the Go Ethereum client, or Geth. And these are, the reason why it's open source is because this software is on GitHub. Anyone can go and look at it, and it's also licensed to the world, so you can modify it, you can reproduce it, et cetera. So what actually can happen is the reason why a blockchain, even though it's a peer-to-peer network, and when you talk to Facebook, right, when you use Facebook, that's a server that is owned by a corporation, and you make requests of the server sends information to you. The reason why it's the same for everyone is because the server is always sending the same information, right? So essentially the server is deciding what the reality of the Facebook experience is. With public blockchains or any peer-to-peer network, Tor, what are other peer-to-peer networks? Torrent, right? Torrent, anything with Tor in the name, right? With these, no one's pinging a server. There's no master server. These are completely peer-run networks. So how do the different peers stay in alignment, stay in consensus with each other, right? Blockchain is a particular solution to that issue. And so the reason why they stay in consensus is because they're all running the same client, right? In the case of Bitcoin, it's like 90% plus dominance of the Bitcoin Core client. There are a couple of other ones that just implement the same rules slightly differently. In the case of Ethereum, almost everyone is running the Geth client. And so because everyone is running the same software, and because that software has techniques to keep people in consensus, even though they're not all reaching out to one server like on Facebook, they're all able to maintain the same reality of what the blockchain is, what the database is, right? Now, what can happen, though, because it's open source, is anyone can take that Geth client, for example, and they can change it slightly. They can say, and in fact, this has happened. I don't know if you guys have heard of the DAO hack, but the DAO was basically like a big venture capital fund on the blockchain where people threw a bunch of their ETH into a smart contract, and then the idea was that the ETH would be sort of reinvested by collective decision making, but it was a huge pot of money, basically, on the blockchain, and it was hacked, right? And, we're talking early in Ethereum's life, like, some very large percentage of the ETH that was out there was suddenly going to be owned by a hacker. So it's like an existential threat. And so what people decided to do is say, well, this is unacceptable. We're gonna take the Geth software and we're actually going to fork it, right? We're going to make a copy of it, and but we're just going to change a couple things. What we're going to change is that ETH that's sitting in that hacker's address is no longer at that hacker's address. It's back where it used to be, and the bug that allowed the hacker to get it is no longer there. So we're basically like rewriting reality, right? That is called a hard fork, okay? So, but that is possible. That's a good reason in that case. It fixed a problem. That is also possible for nefarious reasons, right? If enough people got behind the idea, you could do it the opposite way, right? And fork it and put money where it's not supposed to be to some malicious person's benefit. So there's always this risk, right, of forks, right? The chain can split. And that's sort of a severe one, but there actually are, what a lot of people don't realize in Bitcoin, for example, or Ethereum, there are actually small forks happening all the time, right? Because what's happening is different people are bundling transactions at the same time. They're competing to bundle the transactions into blocks, and because they get a reward if they're the first one. And because of this, and because there's network latency and there are peer-to-peers interacting all over the world, sometimes people come up with blocks at about the same time, right? And so there actually can be little temporary forks, right, where there's two versions. They're going to be very similar, but not identical. And depending on which one wins will determine which miner gets the reward. So these forks are happening all the time, and so there needs to be a consensus rule. In the case of Bitcoin, and currently mostly Ethereum, although it uses a slightly more complicated rule, it's basically like the longest chain wins, right? So eventually one of those two chains is going to get longer than the other one, right? And that'll be the one that becomes the reality, and the other one just gets cast aside. It becomes irrelevant. So these forks are currently happening. What that means in practice, to get back to this drafting example, is if I just send you some ETH, right, on the blockchain, that's not the end of the story. Right? It's not like I sent it to a server and the server wrote that transaction happened and it's done. My transaction sending you ETH might temporarily be reflected in a chain, right? But that chain may not end up becoming the consensus chain. It may be a different chain. So basically what you have to do is you have to account for the fact that there are all these latencies, there are all these potentials for discrepancy, and you have to build in a little bit, you have to build that into your drafting. Right. So basically, well, I'll start with this. Right. So let's just think about that DAO fork. Right. So what resulted from that are actually two versions of Ethereum. Right. And actually both survived. ETH Classic, you may have heard of, and you may have heard of Ethereum. Ethereum's actually the new chain where there was not a DAO hack. Right. It was like canceled retroactively. And ETH Classic is the old chain where the DAO hack still happened and people kind of honored the DAO hack. So when you say, what is ETH, you actually have to be more precise about it, because that could mean ETH Classic, that could mean some other fork of ETH. There are also testnets that have ETH. But what you want is probably the one that's like the most valuable and that most people think of as ETH. So there are a couple different ways to do that. One is sort of like a nominalist approach. You say ETH means ETH as defined by Coinbase or as defined by a majority of major exchanges or some standard like that. It's whatever they call ETH, whatever they have the symbol ETH, not ETC, which is ETH Classic, but ETH. And that, in most cases is going to work pretty well. If you happen to do that on the day of the DAO fork, it would not necessarily work well because there was some chaos. And some of the exchanges temporarily disagreed about which was the true Ethereum. And so, that could be bad. So a more precise way of doing it would be what I call sort of the essentialist approach. And that involves tying it to a particular software client. You say, you know what, I like the Ethereum Foundation. They started Ethereum. Vitalik Buterin is really smart. If there's ever a hard fork, I'm going to go with that software client. So I say ETH means the token recognized by the Geth client as constituting Ether on the Ethereum mainnet, which is network ID 1, and the Ethereum blockchain, chain ID 1. And the Geth client means the official Go Ethereum client of the Ethereum Foundation at this link, right? If you are a believer in client diversity, then there are sufficient clients on the network. You could say, the one recognized by 2 out of these particular 3 clients, something like that. But the point being that ordinarily you don't have to think about this. If you're talking about the U.S. dollar, you don't have to say the U.S. dollar is recognized by the federal government. No, I mean the U.S. dollar is the U.S. dollar, but it is not the same thing with cryptocurrency. These copies can be produced, and people do fight about them, and no one owns the trademark necessarily. So you don't know who's going to win. It's a matter of realpolitik, and so you need to talk to your clients about what they would want in the event of the fork and reflect that accordingly, particularly if you have a contract that's sort of running for a long time. The other thing with sort of those kind of more temporary forks is that if the fact that you sent the transaction to the blockchain, you said, hey, blockchain, hey, network, I want to send this certain amount of ETH to this other address. that is not enough, right? That transaction may sit in the memory of the nodes on the network for a very long time and not be added to the network, to the blockchain, and not become consensus for a long time. So you have to come up with some standard. When are we going to regard this as final? When will it be done? It's certainly not when it's just broadcast to the network. It needs to be when it's not when it's just added to a block. Because remember, we said there could be two chains of blocks, and one of them could end up becoming totally irrelevant. So it has to be a better rule. So what you want to do is you want to focus on the consensus rule for the particular chain. Like, for example, in Bitcoin, it's, the longest chain. You want to say, okay, how many blocks would it take? 7 blocks, 10 blocks, right? And you define it that way. So in the case of ETH, I think currently the standard is like 13 blocks, right? So I define a transfer as basically, there's been broadcast to the network, this transaction, that it's going to go from my address to yours. That's step number 1. But step number 2 is that the transaction has been confirmed. Confirmed means that it's been included in the blockchain in a valid block that is referenced, that is basically, at least 6 blocks deep, right? And the way blockchain security works, because it's all based on cryptography, once it's 6 blocks or 10 blocks, pick your number, it's going to be very, very unlikely that gets reverted. If you're talking 100 blocks, like virtually impossible. There's not enough computing power, almost in the world. So, you can kind of pick your security level, but the point being that you have to have some standard and you have to be specific about that, because if it was just like the transaction gets sent or it's included in one block, guess what? It could be reverted, and even though I sent it to your address and it was in your address at one point, it could end up coming back to me, and now I have the Bitcoin again or the ETH again. But what is this sort of, I've been saying I send it to you, or it's sent from me. What does that really mean? I mean, another feature of blockchain networks is that they're pseudonymous. So actually, like, you can't look at the Bitcoin network and say, there's Gabe. I want to send to Gabe's account. There's no Gabe's account. There's a bunch of, long hexadecimal, numbers that are enumerating addresses, and there's no way of knowing who owns that, whether multiple people might own it, whether it might belong to an exchange or anything. So that's another issue that has to be addressed, right? So basically, in your contracts relating to these types of things, it's a very good practice to spell out in the contract, what address something is going to and what address it is coming from. The reason why you care where it's coming from is because what if that address had also received funds from a terrorist, right? What if it's on the OFAC list? That sort of thing. And because it's a public blockchain, you actually can see the whole history of it. And OFAC and other government agencies are basically starting to maintain lists of like bad accounts that at some point have touched bad, stolen, laundered, whatever, Bitcoin or ETH. So you want to be aware of these things for your clients and make sure that, you're checking against those lists, basically. And ideally that you're getting like reps and warranties from the counterparty saying, hey, this is my address. I rightfully own the private key that controls the spending from this address, and that sort of thing, just to kind of cover your client, cover yourself, and so on. So again, it's just kind of a nuance and it's a different way of thinking, not the end of the world, but you do have to address it. No pun intended. So let's see how we're doing on time here. Oh, I didn't start the timer. What time? Okay, cool. Well, okay. Let me pause there because that's was pretty dense, and I went slightly faster than I intended to. So, do people have questions about that or about blockchain and law generally?
I think maybe I'm wrong, but don't you describing certain property rights on a very basic level and handling the property rights? Forget about the technicals, which is very, very important. But we're talking about how you transfer something X from A to B, and as a lawyer, you're really talking about how you mitigate all the potential risks.
That's right.
To where a dispute over property right to X.
That's right.
From.
Yep.
So all the things that you're describing are valid, and some of the shortcomings of technology. For example, this OFAC issue,
right,
is really upsetting. absurd because, U.S. currency is used for any number of
Right.
$100 bills, but a huge percentage has cocaine on it.
Right.
Nobody controls. If you walk into a bank, nobody, you get I give you $100.
Right.
And nothing happens.
That's
but
right.
If I transfer you, then that may be a OFAC issue.
Right.
But in the end of the day, it's really what are the restrictions, and what you're describing, I think, is how you transfer, how you control and adjust the law and drafting to this new type
Exactly.
of
Yeah.
property.
Right.
Am I understanding?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I would think really this is sort of an example, right? There are many other things like this that one would encounter. The theme really is to kind of show how once you really start to think about it, right, you do need, as a lawyer, you do need to be aware of the nuances of the tech, and you do need to sort of adjust your practice accordingly. And it's not just a black box. It's not just, it's some property that's moving. That's cool. I use the magic property movement words. Actually, the specifics really matter. And you have a responsibility as a lawyer to understand that, understand the legal consequences of it, and advise your client accordingly and draft accordingly. Yeah. Yes?
Maybe I didn't understand what you said when we were talking about hard forks. So we have a hard fork, one stays and the other one goes away, you said, right?
Well, actually, no, that's the interesting thing. They both stay. Yeah, so they both stay. So, when, Ethereum, we started out with Ethereum, right, in late 2015 or early 2015, and Ethereum was going. It was all one chain. It was functioning according to the rules. Then there was this hack. There was this bad thing that people didn't like, and they said, "Yeah, we really want to reverse this, right?" But since it's a public network, it's not like if Facebook wants to change its website, it just changes it, right? And no one can say anything because the only way they had of getting it was interacting with Facebook servers. In this case, because it's open source, actually there was a disagreement, right? Some people said, well, what do you mean? We're not forking it. The whole point of this blockchain thing, was that code is law, so to speak, and if you can make a change in the code, then it stays and we're stuck with it. So there was a disagreement. So basically you could think of it as a schism. So the majority said, nope, we're getting rid of this. But a minority said, no, that's ridiculous. And so what happened was, the people who wanted to change it, changed it. That resulted in the creation of a chain that was identical to the old one up until a particular point of time. And from that point forward, it was different. Because certain transactions that used to be valid, like moving ETH from this hacker's account or address, no longer were valid. And so it was basically a new, consensus. But the old one, people didn't abandon it because there were some hardcore people who said, no, we're going to stick to this one. This is the real Ethereum. And they fought a little bit over the name. And at one point, even the what is now called Ethereum Classic, the original chain, that ETH, that token was worth more in dollar terms on the exchanges than the new ETH for a brief time. Ultimately, the new chain won. So actually, what people think of as Ethereum is actually newer than ETH Classic, but it just happened to win. Now, but the thing is, you never know which way it's going to go, right? Because in the case of Bitcoin has had many forks, right? You guys have heard of Bitcoin Cash, right? So Bitcoin Cash is a fork of Bitcoin. Now, if the same rule always applied, then just like in the case of ETH, then the new chain would have been Bitcoin and the old chain would have been Bitcoin Cash. But that's not how it went. The old chain, in that case, the old chain is Bitcoin and the new chain is Bitcoin Cash. So these things, it's not like, with a company where they own the trademark and they get to control. It really is a matter of realpolitik. It's very, very messy. And you don't know which way it's going to go. You don't know what will end up being called Bitcoin or Bitcoin Nouveau or whatever. So you have to think about those contingencies, particularly if you have a long-running contract, and account for them and talk to your client about them. Does that make sense?
So basically, the hacker really didn't get punished?
Well, they did well, it depends how you look at it. I mean, they didn't get as much value as they could have gotten, right? But they still got a lot of value. And some people say that, I mean, I have a whole thing in here about the DAO hack, but...
Can we talk about the DAO hack afterwards?
Yeah, sure, yeah. So anyway, we could do more Q&A at the end, but long story short, he won in multiple ways. First of all, people think he shorted ETH before the hack. So when it went down in value because of the hack, he made money off of the short. And then in addition, because ETH Classic ended up having significant value, he also made money for that. And he actually invested, supposedly, in the people who were kind of continuing development in ETH Classic. So kind of crazy, but yeah, all in good fun.